Hello, this is Insight from the studios of Washington, D.C. ESAT Insight is the English program. Today on Insight, we will discuss the call between President Biden and Prime Minister Abiy. Why did President Biden call Prime Minister Abiy? When President Biden took office, he called the leaders of Kenya and other African countries, but not Ethiopia. When President Biden held the Summit of Democracies, he invited the leaders of Nigeria, the leaders of Kenya, but not the leader of Ethiopia. This week, President Biden changed that path. He called President Abiy. Why did he call President Abiy? Is this the product of the change of balance in the battlefield? Is this the compromise, or is this a negotiating tactic to bring Ethiopia in agreement with the TPLF? We will discuss these issues. To explain to us these issues, we have invited a seasoned diplomat, Ambassador David Shinn. Ambassador David Shinn has served the ambassador in Ethiopia, the U.S. ambassador in Ethiopia, and also in Burkina Faso. Welcome, Ambassador.
Thank you, Gizar.
Let me just start from a general question. What did you make of the call between President Biden and Prime Minister Abiy?
Well, first, I would point out that although, to the best of my knowledge, this is the first conversation that the American president under the Biden administration has had with Prime Minister Abiy, there has been a fair amount of contact at the level of the Secretary of State. So it's not as though there has been no high-level contact up to this point in time. As far as President Biden's phone call is concerned, it certainly is important in that it attaches importance to the Ethiopian-American relationship. And I think that is perhaps more significant than the timing of it, or the fact that it is the American president talking with the prime minister. I think the situation has become such between the United States and Ethiopia that the U.S. does want to underscore that it considers Ethiopia an important partner, and even though the U.S. has differences with Ethiopia, particularly concerning what has happened around the conflict in the country, that does not diminish the importance that the U.S. attaches to Ethiopia. You mentioned that Ethiopia was not invited to the Democracy Summit that was organized by the Biden administration, and that's true. But if you look at the list of invitees, my recollection is less than 20 African countries were invited to that. So Ethiopia was on a very long list of countries that was not invited. But the point is that this phone call is significant by dint of the fact that it happened at all. And we can talk more about the substance of the call, although obviously I was not there and you were not there, so we don't know exactly what was said. And the readout from both the White House and the Prime Minister's office is very brief in both cases. The readout from the White House is actually somewhat more detailed than anything I have seen from the Prime Minister's office.
I think I will mention 2 points. One is, as you said, 20 African countries were invited, but we have to remember Ethiopia is the second most populous nation in Africa, and Ethiopia also is a linchpin of stability in the Horn of Africa, and also there is a significant Ethiopian American community which is making voting in the U.S. election. So. But let me just ask you, one thing I want to make clear is that American presidents do not call every leader of another country. From what I understand, very few leaders get calls from the U.S. President. Is that true?
I suppose that is true. in that, let's take just the 54 African countries. If you look at the number of African leaders who are contacted directly by the American president or invited to the White House over the course of a 4-year term, it's going to be clearly a minority of the countries on the continent. The larger, more important countries will obviously be the ones that will most likely receive the attention. Countries like Nigeria and South Africa, Kenya, Ethiopia, Egypt, maybe the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and a couple of others. And some of them will not receive any contact. So in terms of sheer numbers, I think your comment is accurate. If you move to other parts of the world, the European countries are going to have much more contact just because there's been the traditional relations between the United States and Europe. Possibly the Latin American countries will receive a little more attention because they're closer to the U.S. and have a very long economic relationship with the U.S. But it's going to vary enormously, and I think it's probably true that a majority of countries do not get the level of presidential attention that a country like Ethiopia has traditionally received.
I raise this because, as you remember, when former President Trump met with the leader of North Korea, there is a lot of complaint from the American foreign establishment because it elevated the North Korean leader to a higher status. So most political observers believe the fact that President Biden called Prime Minister Abiy signifies change in not necessarily in policy, but in approach. And also, apparently, you didn't read out the background information, background briefing that was given by the White House. The language used in the briefing was much more accommodating than threatening. So, when you look at it from a optics point of view, do you think this is a new approach by the American administration? Are the days of threats and sanctions being replaced with diplomacy and cooperation?
And a document that I perhaps have not seen, I did read the brief statement that came from the White House that discussed the actual phone call between the Prime Minister and the President. I have not seen a background statement, so I'm not familiar with what is in that. And if that was more positive and forthcoming, that would be an important indicator. But I'm reluctant to comment on it since I haven't seen it. In any event, if you take just the statement on the actual phone call, it lays out pretty clearly the issues that have been of concern to the Biden administration over the past year. They're all mentioned there: a desire for a ceasefire in Ethiopia, humanitarian access throughout the country, particularly in the Tigray region, some human rights concerns about political detentions, a desire to cooperate, to work closely with the African Union in terms of reaching a solution. These are civilian casualties as a result of airstrikes or drone strikes. These are all the issues that have been talked about for the past year. So I don't really see any real change in terms of policy as the issues are laid out in the summary of the conversation. But you may be right in that the background briefing may have been an effort to try to establish groundwork that leads to a more cordial relationship.
Mm-hmm. In the background briefing, actually, they say that the reasons why the president called they mentioned, I will just mention two of them. One was security crisis within the region, with the regional implications, and also the fight with Al-Shabaab. So the president was concerned about these two things, but also, as you said, he demanded unfettered access to humanitarian aid, which the prime minister has agreed to and has mentioned from the beginning. And then he also mentioned the U.S. desire or the U.S. Demand that the Ethiopian army not proceed to Tigray. He also mentioned that halting airstrikes, particularly those that have caused loss of lives, and engaging in direct talks. So when since you didn't read it, but I want to ask you, the first two, security crisis, regional implications, and fight against Al-Shabaab. As you know, Sudan is in turmoil, and Al-Shabaab is getting stronger. Somalia is have a political rift between the prime minister and the president. So it looks like the U.S. is realizing that the Horn of Africa needs Ethiopia, and the only representative of Ethiopia is the prime minister. Would you like to comment on that? I know you didn't read it, but...
Well, no, I know the issues, and I follow what is going on in both Sudan and Somalia fairly closely. And the U.S. is clearly very concerned about what is happening in both countries. The situation in Somalia has not changed significantly in the last year or two. It's still very unstable, and it still requires a lot of attention, but there hasn't been enormous change there. There has been huge change in Sudan, and I think the U.S. is particularly concerned about Sudan and where the military is taking the country, and whether there is a real opportunity for a return to civilian government there. But at the same, and certainly Ethiopia can play a positive role in all of this. But at the same time, one must be realistic. What can Ethiopia do about the situation in Sudan at the moment? It has forces in Abiy, and that's a positive contribution. But that's not really the issue in Sudan today. It's an internal domestic political issue that neither Ethiopian or any other country in the region really has any ability to resolve. For that matter, I wonder whether the African Union can even do it. In the case of Somalia, Ethiopia has traditionally been more involved, but my understanding is that it has even pulled out some of its troops from Somalia because of the situation in Ethiopia. I don't know what the numbers are today in terms of Ethiopian forces in Somalia. And I believe it still has some there, but the numbers, I believe, are less than they once were. So this is not to denigrate at all Ethiopia's role in either country, but at the same time, you've got to be realistic. There are limitations as to what Ethiopia can do.
True, but we also remember Prime Minister Abiy was instrumental in convincing the Sudanese to set up a civilian government. When Hamdok came to power, the prime minister was a mediator. But in general, when we look at this call, should we assume the status quo is still in place, or should we assume that while substantive change has not happened, at least the U.S. seems to be interested in working with the Ethiopian government?
Yeah, I think in terms of substance, and again, I'm not part of the administration and I wasn't part of the phone call, so one is doing a certain amount of extrapolating based on 37 years of diplomatic experience. But that tells me that the substance has not really changed, at least not significantly. What has changed is the tactics and the tone and the approach, and a desire to try to leave the door a little more open, particularly to dialogue, and to be more accommodative if there are changes on the Ethiopian side that look like they are moving a little bit more in the direction the United States would like to see. And I would say that particularly applies to humanitarian access for both United Nations organizations and humanitarian aid groups in Tigray or any other part of Ethiopia where they're needed. And at the moment, I think that's primarily in Tigray region. And then also the issue of any air attacks on civilian targets is, I think, of great concern to the United States. And if there's movement on those issues, I think there will be much greater willingness from the U.S. side to try to accommodate some of the concerns of the government in Addis Ababa.
Those are such important points. For one thing, Ethiopians, the prime minister, his government, and all Ethiopians want humanitarian aid to reach the people of Tigray. The problem is both bureaucratic, but also intrusions by the TPLF. In Abala, in Afar, the TPLF has consistently attacked the only roads that is used for humanitarian aid. More than 1,000 trucks have been confiscated and used for military aggression by the TPLF. So Ethiopians usually get a little bit sensitive when the US, the EU, the United Nations do not criticize the TPLF or even demand the TPLF that it return the trucks and it does not interfere with the delivery of aid. Why is that not forthcoming from the West in general and the United Nations also?
Part of the problem is the West, if I can speak very generally, is concerned that it doesn't have all the facts in terms of what is going on in Tigray region particularly. The international press is not allowed into Tigray now. So the only sort of information that comes out of there, other than that provided by the government of Ethiopia, is the occasional tidbit from members of the United Nations team, or from time to time something that a humanitarian aid organization is able to pass on. I don't know what the numbers are on numbers of trucks that have been confiscated by the TPLF. You're using a number of 1,000, I believe. I don't know where that number comes from. I don't know how it's calculated. It may be accurate, it may not be accurate. There's a real information void still in Tigray, and I think the West is suspicious of the information that's coming out, and it would like to be able to verify exactly what is happening. And if, in fact, that number is accurate, and the TPLF is, in fact, confiscating or taking control of 1,000 trucks, and if that's the reason for the inability to provide humanitarian assistance, then by all means, the TPLF should be criticized or condemned. But this is information that is virtually impossible to verify.
You probably know, and we have been trying to reach to the United Nations. The aid organizations that are in Tigray have consistently provided false information, including about famine, like the numbers were added, and 2 UN employees who stood their ground were suspended. So we will come to that discussion when we get a chance. But one issue that was raised on unfettered access to humanitarian aid, now that Ethiopia has upper hand in militarily, I think that will be done. The other issue that was raised was Ethiopian army not going to Tigray. And the prime minister and the Ethiopian government has stopped the advance of the Ethiopian army into Tigray. So it is credit to the State Department and the US government that they have recognized that. But why wouldn't the US ask the TPLF to disarm and participate in national reconciliation?
Well, it certainly has asked the Tigrayan forces to participate in national dialogue. That has been the argument from the beginning. just like the United States pretty consistently opposed the movement by the Tigrayan Defense Forces leaving Tigray region and going into Amhara and Afar regions. It called for them to pull back early on once they started that effort. So I think the position of the U.S. on that score has been fairly consistent.
Mr. Ambassador, are you suggesting that this brings us to the next question, the issue of negotiated ceasefire? Is the U.S., and from your understanding, we all know you are not part of the government, so we are asking you to learn from your experience. Is the U.S. government asking Ethiopia to negotiate with an armed insurgent group? Is that what the idea is, or is the negotiation or national reconciliation is supposed to happen after TPLF disarms?
Well, I think the U.S. is leaving that open. I haven't seen any comment one way or the other on it. But let me answer a question with a question. I don't know, and I don't know whether you know or not. What is the position of the majority of the Tigrayan people today vis-a-vis the TPLF? I don't know the answer to that. All we have by way of evidence is what took place in the last election. That information may be out of date now. If you were to have an election today in Tigray, you might have a different result. I don't know. But if for the sake of argument, there still is widespread support in Tigray for the TPLF, how do you realistically exclude them from negotiations if they represent the views of a majority or significant, well, let's say a majority of Tigrayans? Well, the problem is we don't have the answer to the question as to what they represent at the moment. But I don't know how you exclude them if you make the assumption that they have widespread support.
Yeah, Mr. Ambassador, there are two arguments against that. One is TPLF attacked the Northern Command. They are criminals. They killed their comrades while they were sleeping, the Ethiopian Defense Forces. In any country, armed groups that commit crime are not invited to national dialogue. The second question, and a very more important question, is, as you asked, what is the view of the majority of the Tigrayans? Why doesn't the U.S. government consider the views of the majority, the vast majority of Ethiopians who are adamant that they will never include TPLF, not the Tigrayan people, not other Tigrayan forces, but the TPLF in any negotiations? So the issue, if we are asking what do the Tigrayans want, is only fair that what do the Ethiopians want. So the issue here is not Tigrayans not participating. The issue is there is a particular group that has committed crimes, treason, that attack the Ethiopian Defense Forces. So why would the US and the West provide tacit moral support by recognizing them? Why doesn't the US encourage the Tigrayans to bring other leaders to the forefront so that the Ethiopian government can negotiate?
Well, again, if you accept, and I don't know the answer to the question, that there is still widespread support among Tigrayans for the TPLF, what do you accomplish by holding negotiations with Tigrayan representatives who do not have the support of a wide segment of the Tigrayan population? You're negotiating with elements that have no power, that have no influence in that situation. I would like to know, what is the view of the Tigrayan people? You're saying, well, just accept the views of the vast majority of Ethiopians. Forget about the forget about the Tigrayans. Well, that's all well and good, but the party that's in dispute here are the Tigrayans. And if you don't have representatives of the Tigrayans who count for something, I don't know where the negotiations go.
But again, just to remind you, the second point, there are no other regional armed groups, or they are not included in armed groups. If Ethiopia were to reward with negotiations a regional army, an ethnic regional army, an army that has suppressed the Ethiopians for 30 years, don't you think that is the wrong incentive to give to the other regional forces? And wouldn't that basically create warlords overnight in the rest of the country?
Well, I think we need to be a little bit careful about other regional armies in Ethiopia. The situation in Tigray is not totally unique, and there are militias, other ethnic militias in other parts of the country that have been part of this. And if you want to go down that route, that's fine, but I don't think that takes us anywhere. I'm just trying to be realistic and identify those groups or those people that reflect a wide body of opinion. And as I say, I would like to know whether that's the case or not, and I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, I will move to the next question, but to be clear, the other regional forces, yes, there are Amara, Oromo, Sidama, South, and all that, Somali, and all that. But Afar, but all these forces have not attacked the federal army, and are also working with the federal army under the leadership of the Ethiopian Prime Minister and the elected Ethiopian government. So the TPLF is not similar to them. I will go to the next U.S. demand, that is airstrikes. We all agree, and I think to the credit of the President Biden, and in the background briefing, they talked about particularly those that have caused losses of life among civilians. So it leaves room that some airstrikes against military targets are sort of okay, or we don't mind. Any sovereign country in the world can use its military force, including drones and airstrikes, against belligerent groups. So don't you agree that should be Ethiopia's prerogative to use such a force?
No, but the issue is the targeting. And again, we do not have information from independent sources that can verify what the targeting seems to have been. The most recent one, allegedly, was a flour factory. Now, I don't know whether that's the case or not. I wasn't there. But information coming from some of the aid groups suggests that is what happened, that a factory for producing flour was the target of the attack. Well, if that's true, clearly that's not a military target, and that is, I think, a subject for legitimate criticism. So I think that is the issue here.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the targeting should be an issue. I agree, but we also should acknowledge that collateral damage has happened not only by Ethiopian forces, but even by the most technologically advanced countries. So, but I agree, the targeting should be an issue. I want to ask you another question. As you know, in the last few weeks, maybe a couple of months, the Ethiopian forces have the upper hand. Do you think the U.S. policy will factor the battlefield balance of power and hence adjust its policies and approaches?
I missed the first part of that question. Could you repeat the opening part?
Yes. Over the last 6 weeks or 2 months, Ethiopian forces have the upper hand in militarily. They have pushed back the TPLF all the way back to Tigray, and they have stopped entering Tigray because of international pressure. Would that influence the U.S. policy to recalibrate its policy towards the Ethiopian Prime Minister or Ethiopian government?
Well, it certainly can have an impact on it. One of the issues that is a little unclear is the degree to which the Tigrayan forces were pushed back and the degree to which they withdrew. And they clearly were pushed back from the area getting close to Addis Ababa. They overextended their supply lines. And I think they found that considerable damage was done to those supply lines, and that clearly was a question of being pushed back. Once they got closer to the border with Tigray, it's a little less clear in my mind as to whether there was a decision within the Tigrayan Defense Forces to then literally pull back, or whether they were in fact forced back. I don't know the answer to that. So I'm a little reluctant to comment on the military significance of it. But I do think there's a question to be answered there. But the fact remains that the Tigrayan forces overextended themselves and militarily, I think, got into difficulty and were, in fact, pushed back out of considerable sections of particularly Amhara territory by the Ethiopian Defense Forces. And that obviously will play into anyone's calculations as to where to go from here.
Yeah, it's very interesting. With due respect, Mr. Ambassador, it is a couple of months ago, the one of the generals, General Adkan, was talking about there is no negotiation. The war is over. We're going to take Addis. The regional governor of Tigray, Debrecen, was saying that there is no more war. He made a call to the Ethiopian army to surrender. You shouldn't lose your life. And some Western, many of them, I should say, most Western governments evacuated their staff from Addis Ababa. And it is very clear TPLF did not withdraw. There are written and video evidences that show that TPLF wanted to enter Addis Ababa. To my understanding, even the State Department facilitated a TPLF formed the Confederalist forces in Washington, D.C., in the press club. So the idea that the TPLF was pulled back, I think I understand your point. I really, with due respect, but it just is not true. TPLF was destroyed, and the people in the regions, the Afars and the Amaras, fought back. So, but I want to go to another issue. There are two issues that are not in the U.S. vocabulary anymore. One of them is the issue of basic services like internet, telephone, electricity, and things like that. Why do you think these issues have disappeared from the U.S. demands?
I'm not sure that they have disappeared from U.S. concerns. I'm not totally up to date in terms of whether the internet is open or closed in Ethiopia now. It seems to sometimes go on and off, and I don't always know when there's a change in the situation. If it's possible that it's back on again, then that would explain why it's not being talked about at the moment. But I don't know the answer to that. I don't know whether it's currently shut down or not. I do know that the international press is not allowed into Tigray, and as a result, we're not getting very much independent information out of Tigray. And I think the United States would like to see more openness in terms of the media being allowed in there, so we have a better idea of what's going on.
Raise some issues about the international press, but I want to stay on this because any war, when the Taliban was fighting against the US-supported Afghan government, did the Afghan government provide internet services to the Taliban-held areas? Did they provide electricity and telephone to the Taliban-held areas? Has there ever been a country? Has there ever? Huh?
I have no idea what the Afghan government did vis-a-vis the Taliban, but I'm not sure I see the point of the question. We're talking about shutting down the internet, I believe, for pretty much the entire country, are we not?
No, we are talking about to Tigray, shutting down telephones, and I'm talking about to Tigray in general. My point is this. Maybe Ambassador, you may know, I have been thinking about this. There has never been a country that have been demanded to provide basic services to an armed belligerent group. When the US invaded Iraq, it attacked the infrastructure, light, and all that stuff until Saddam's forces were destroyed. When the US went to Afghanistan, the rebel held areas never had internet or electricity or banking services. So why is Ethiopia being asked to provide services to a region that is clearly waging war against the central government?
Well, I haven't seen any requests that are aimed specifically at opening services in Tigray. I was under the impression that it was a request for keeping the services open countrywide.
So I want to go to the next issue that seems to have disappeared. I don't know if you are familiar. Initially, when Secretary Blinken came to power, every opening of his speech was so-called Western Tigray. Of course, there is no such a thing, Western Tigray. He used to demand that Western Tigray has to be given back to the TPLF. And nowadays, the US government communique never mention Western Tigray. Does the absence of this language, does it suggest the US gradually is recalibrating its positions?
I don't recall that Blinken or anyone else said that Western Tigray must be given back to the TPLF. You've seen something or read something I have not seen.
Okay. Last question I want to ask you is about the international media. Most Ethiopians do not really believe the international media. Of course, there could be different explanations for that. One of them is every narrative. For example, if you take CNN, as former President Trump said, fake news CNN, they had a news on their screen saying that Addis Ababa has been surrounded and will fall the TPLF in a few days. So the international media has been regurgitating TPLF propaganda, and the hesitance of the Ethiopian government to give access to the Western media. Actually, Western media is still in Ethiopia. I don't know if it is in Tigray. Is because they have been doing a very unbalanced job, and the narrative they provided was wrong. I mean, is there any? Most of the people that are invited on BBC, Al Jazeera, France 24 are English Irish people that have no idea about Ethiopia. It's like Alex Duval and David, William Davidson, and things like that. Ethiopians have never invited to the table to present their case by BBC and CNN and Al Jazeera. So we don't have confidence in the Western media. Would you like to comment on that?
Clear. The Western media and the international media generally is not in Tigray today. They're not allowed in by the government in Addis Ababa. So you're not going to get much coverage at all, except whatever they can pick up by telephone or through contacts with UN officials or humanitarian aid officials. The Western media, I mean, you're right in that they are going to make mistakes, and they do. And good Western media will eventually correct those mistakes and indicate they were wrong, and try to go on from there with something that is accurate. But the idea of completely keeping them out of an area because they do make an occasional mistake, I don't think is the answer either. I mean, it's not as though everything I have heard from the government of Ethiopia is accurate. How many months did we go from with the prime minister and others saying there are no Eritrean troops in Tigray? I mean, give me a break. That went on for months until he finally said, "Well, yeah, they're there, but you know, they're good guys and we like them, and so be it." So you have problems on all elements of the media, whether it's the Western media or the government sponsored media.
Mhm. I'm glad you raised the issue of Eritrea. I wanted one of the issues President Biden, not President Biden, but the background briefing mentioned was the role of Eritrea. And Ethiopians, I will say, not only the government, I would say the majority of Ethiopians are very grateful TPLF, I mean, Eritrea provided support to the Ethiopian army when it was the Northern Command, when it was attacked by the TPLF about a year ago. And that has created a closer relationship between Ethiopia and Eritrea. Why is the US government bothered by the close relationship between Ethiopia and Eritrea?
It's not that they're bothered by the close relationship between Ethiopia and Eritrea. I think the United States welcomed the peace agreement that Prime Minister Abiy negotiated with the Eritreans and the prospect for cordial relations between the two countries. The concern of the United States is the entry into Ethiopia of Eritrean forces for whatever reason. Now, in this case, supporting the central government. But my time in Ethiopia goes back to 1998, and the border conflict involving Bidne, and then the 2-year war between Ethiopia and Eritrea, when I can assure you there were a lot of Ethiopians who were not happy with the Eritreans. Now, I think you're right. There are a lot of Ethiopians who do appreciate their military support following the attack on the Northern Command. But this is a totally different situation than taking it back to 1998.
But Ambassador, the Ethiopian army is in Somalia. I remember I believe in the mid 1990s, the Ethiopian army went into Somalia to get rid of Al-Shabaab, to kick Al-Shabaab out of Mogadishu. So in this case, there is video evidence that Getachew Redda claiming that they attacked Asmara with a missile. Let's remember, when we talk about air attacks, the first air attack, or it's not air, but missile attack was launched by the TPLF. One of them went, a couple of them went to Asmara, a couple of them went to Gondar, a couple of them went to Bardar. So when we talk about the army of a country going into another country, the US never objected, actually supported. Actually, I remember President Obama complimented the Ethiopian army for going into Somalia. So if Ethiopia government invites and agrees that the Eritrean forces are needed to support Ethiopia at the time, why can't the US accept that?
Well, I think it's probably dangerous to try to equate all of these situations in either the Horn of Africa or other parts of the world. First off, the Ethiopian forces went into Somalia to deal with the Islamic courts, not the Al-Shabaab. Al-Shabaab had not yet even been created yet. It evolved out of the Islamic courts. And I think, quite frankly, I think there were some mistakes made during that time by both the United States and Ethiopia. I think there was something of a misreading of what the Islamic courts were up to, but that's a whole other story, and we probably don't want to get into that now. The point is that I'm not sure I see the similarities between the Ethiopian and U.S. positions on dealing with Somalia and the situation involving Eritrea and Tigray, or Eritrea and Ethiopia. My recollection is that any missile attacks on Asmara, and I don't recall the timing of that at all, came after the engagement of Eritrean forces inside Tigray. That's my recollection. And if that's the case, then you get to the question of who struck first. The point being that if you're a Tigrayan, you're going to be very concerned if a foreign army comes in and engages in the attack on you. And you're probably going to hit back if you have the capacity to do that. And I think the capacity was extremely limited by the Tigrayan forces, and that's why you saw so little response.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Ambassador, I'm so grateful. In case I did not raise any question you want to address, and you want some concluding remarks, let me give you a chance.
Well, the only concluding remark is I think there is something of an opening now for discussions, for dialogue, in order to bring this conflict to an end. I hope that all parties take advantage of it, but I would go back to a point that we were talking about earlier. I realize that a lot of Ethiopians want to exclude the TPLF from any discussions. I just don't see how you do that if they represent a very significant body of opinion in Tigray. I don't know how you can exclude them, because I don't see how you have meaningful discussions with representatives who don't represent a wide number of people who live in that area. And I realize this may not be a predominant view throughout Ethiopia, but the idea is to end the conflict. And if you have to have talks with people you don't like, frankly, I don't see a problem with that.
Just one question from what you just said. When you say the TPLF, you mean a negotiation or with armed TPLF or with disarmed TPLF?
Well, I'm not. How do you get anyone to totally disarm before you talk? What do you do? Do you have an international body come in and take all of the arms from the TPLF? Does the government of Ethiopia send its troops and occupy Tigray and take all the arms and then they're disarmed, so then they will talk? You don't have any leverage whatsoever at that point if you do that. I just don't know how that works. It seems to me that if you can get a ceasefire and you can remove any Tigrayan forces from any part of neighboring Afar and Amhara, that you've accomplished what you need to accomplish.
Mr. Ambassador, I thank you very much, and I hope to see you pretty soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
This has been Insight from ESAT, Washington, D.C. For today, this is our program. Bye.